Now sit back and prepare to be entertained.
Oh, you changed your name. Yeah, I caught you this time. So we're back at the Dripping Bucket, just as chaotic as ever. We've kept Stephen Aryan, but we've replaced Michael R Fletcher with David Gemmell. Hello, Mr. Gemmell. It's so nice to meet you. It's an honor or something. Yeah. I heard you're tall, but I don't know.
Yeah, super tall.
You're sitting down. It's hard to tell. So.
Yeah, I'm very short chair.
Yep.
So I made this threat that we would talk about Gemmell in this episode, and then we talked about Gemmell a bunch between recordings. So we decided, let's just actually talk about it.
Yeah, hopefully everyone's memorized what they said in the break between episodes, and so we can just perfectly rehash what was a super interesting conversation, but now will be awkward and stilted.
Sure, let's do it.
Well, Stephen, you were telling us about how you met him one time, so let's just start back there. You can retell the story of your glory. Yeah, it's really great. Thanks, bud.
All right, moving on.
He used to tour around the UK reasonably often for his new books, and it was around the time he did Wolf and Shadow, which was the third Waylander book. He'd done a few Drust novels by then. I think he'd started doing the Riganti.
I think he'd started the Riganti by then. Yeah.
So we'd had quite a lot of books out there. We'd had all the John Shano books, and then he kind of came back because he went. And we thought we were done with Waylander because he hadn't done Waylander in ages.
Yeah.
And they did Wolf and Shadow, and
it was really good.
Yeah, and it's like an old man Waylander almost. You know, we had Old Man Logan. 40 years too fucking late. We had it. Someone's done it before. Anyway, Old Man Waylander. And so, we had that. And I went and saw him at the Waterstones. And he did a great talk. Everyone asked questions. He asked if anybody was a writer in the room. A very young, early 20-something me sheepishly put his hand up and said, yes, yes. Yeah, as my testicles were dropping, you know. And so, I said I was, and he gave us all encouragement, and he said, it's a lot of luck, it's a lot of hard work, you just got to keep trying, so good luck to you. You signed my book. I left very happy, and it was a great opportunity to meet him. And then the other thing was, years later, after I was published, I went to Bragelonne, who was my French publisher for my first trilogy, and they published him pretty much all of his books. Like, he was massive in France. Like, I knew in other countries he was quite popular, but in France, he's like Sapkowski is in Poland. He was, so big over there. So when I went through the publisher's library, they have all the books that they published, and it's just like this wall of all the French translations of Gemmell. I was like walking by, like, cool. All these covers I've never seen because we've never seen them outside of, France. And they were amazing. And there was interviews, and they were telling me stories about how he used to come in. And so I was just there like that. Just listening to all the publishers that had met him so many times that they were friends of his. That was worth a trip just alone. Never mind anything else.
And they were publishing your books too.
Publishing my books. I won an award, all that sort of stuff. Great, but finding out these kind of anecdotal stories about David Gemmell, that was special. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say I was late teens, early 20s when I discovered Gemmell. Mm-hmm. The first one was Legend, was the first of his that I read.
Yes.
Yeah. He is the quintessential heroic fantasy author, and he is the perfect writer to get a young male or possibly female into trouble because you read a David Gemmell book and then you're on a public bus and you see some sort of minor injustice and you're like, no, I will not stand for this. And then, later you're like, I probably should learn how to fight if I'm going to be a dumbass like that.
Yeah. My first, I think I was about 12 or so. And it was Midnight Falcon. So the one with Bane the Bastard. And man, I bounced hard off of my dad's fantasy, where like he read like the old school heroic stuff where all the heroes were really good actually, and they never made any mistakes and all that stuff. And I just could not. I could not. And I could feel myself wanting to like the genre, but I hated all the characters that he loved. And then Bane the Bastard, this angry, vengeful, bitter teenager, walks into my life, and like that book, that book is the reason I'm writing. So it's really cool to hear from other writers, because he's not that big in Canada. Like I feel like even when he was still alive and publishing all the time, like he didn't get a lot of shelf space over here. So it's cool, at this stage of my life, to connect to British authors and such who, find him foundational as well. So
I think up to that point, I'd read, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. I'd read a lot of Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, a lot of David Eddings, a lot of Terry Brooks, and they're all good for different reasons. And and Ursula Le Guin and a bunch of other stuff. They're all good for different reasons. It was in my early teenage years I first read Gemmell, and I was like, these guys are flawed. They're not always the best. And the others failed sometimes. But I realized at this point, this is another aspect of fantasy I hadn't seen up to that point in my reading history. I mean, Weiss and Hickman, they're another couple that don't get nearly enough praise for what they did. And because over here, for those who aren't old enough to remember, there was this thing that we had before the fucking internet, which was a great time. And so I read these Dragonlance books. I had no idea they're connected to a game. No one told me. There's nothing to tell me that. The only thing I'd ever find it is in a magazine, and I'm not going to go buy a magazine in a newsagents. I mean, and they had fancy in lots of different genres, and as flawed as their characters were, they were all still really good people. Even the villains were kind of a little bit too clean, but Gemmell's were just
his heroes
people struggling.
Were not clean. Yeah.
They're just people who are usually extraordinary in some ways, caught up in really complex, difficult situations where it's not black and white. I mean, it's that black hat, white hat thing, and it's like, it's not that. Everything's grey.
Yeah.
And that's what I got from him early on. Before that, it had been very black and white fantasy.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, if you had to pick one of Gemmell's books to be your sort of like definitive, this is the one, what would it be?
Oh fuck.
I'm glad you asked him first, because it's given me time to come up with an answer.
It's probably going to be Legends still, I think. Even though it's not his best book, even though there are flaws in it and there are things that now kind of make me cringe or wince, he never did what other writers have done, like Stephen King's gone back and retweaked the first Dark Tower book and added stuff to it and fixed it and stuff as a better writer 20, 30 years on. And I think Gemmell had that opportunity, and he just kind of went, nah, it is what it is when I wrote it. So if I go back and read my first book from 13 years ago, I'm sure there are things in there that I'd be like, yeah, I don't. But equally, that's who I was then. And I think his books reflect that. You go back and read his 20th book compared to Legend, and by then he's written a bunch of Druss novels. The later Druss novels, I would argue, have better characterization.
Yeah.
Because he's a much better writer. He's had time to think beyond the archetype that he set up. The premise that he created it based on his stepfather, based upon the cancer diagnosis, based on all these other pressures that were on him at the moment. And he wrote it in a record amount of time, everyone says. So all of that was packed into this novel. But later on, it's like, right, you're not dying. You've got time to think about these characters. You've got time to plan it and add layers. What are you going to do with Druss? And he sat back and gone, right, that's interesting. So I liked the later Druss books better, but Legend broke a lot of new ground for me that no one else had done before in my reading history. So it has to be Legend. What's your favorites then, since I've just babbled?
So my favorites wouldn't necessarily be the same as my answer for this, because I feel like my favorites are the quirky ones that don't get as much attention. But I feel like if I were to recommend one Gemmell novel to somebody and say, like, if you don't like this, you won't like his work. And if you do like this, I've got great news for you. There's lots of books left. It would be Legend of the Deathwalker.
Yes.
And the reason Legend isn't my answer is just because, like, if you don't, I didn't read that book until probably a dozen books through his catalog, and I love it for what it is, and I love it for how it's the first step in his path, but as it is, it just, I could see somebody bouncing off of it just because it is so dated.
Yeah.
But Legend of the Deathwalker, I feel like that book does kind of revisit the idea without going back to rewrite the book. Like, he didn't rewrite Legend, and I respect that, but Legend of the Deathwalker kind of circles around and has a more mature outlook on war. And it seems to be a bit of a pivot point for him, where his books started getting a lot longer after that one. And I think that's something, I don't know the history of it, but from a storyteller's point of view, it seems like something in his worldview was shifting at that point. And at Legend of the Deathwalker, it's a little bit sad. It's doomed, but it's still heroic, and it's still got that Gemmell spirit of flawed characters trying and failing and trying again. And I think if you're not a David Gemmell fan already, it would be a good one to convince you to give him a shot.
Yeah.
Because Legend was the first Gemmell book that I ever picked up. He had a couple out already. That one is just sort of like forever carved into me as sort of definitive Gemmell. I remember, and it's been decades, The King at the Gate. That one left a mark as well.
King Beyond the Gate.
King Beyond the Gate, yeah. That one left a mark.
Winter Warriors.
That's the second one, I think. Yeah, Winter Warriors was a good one. I really liked Winter Warriors.
I don't even remember which one it is, but which is the one where the guy has like a demon living in him, and it kind of talks to him?
Oh, that's Dark Moon. That's Tarantino and Dace. So that one is a standalone
as well.
It's got the aliens in it. Like, that one was a really weird standalone where it's the alien invasion. Can I spoil that old of a book? I was really mad that that Dace was taken out of him. I was like, no, they're perfect together. This is good. Yeah. If you want to give me another pop quiz, let's see if I can.
No. So this slight tangent, but Stephen King, whenever he used to do books in bookshop things, and he'd go and talk to people, and he'd say, right, who's read It? Who's read The Stand? And like everyone puts their hand up, and he'd say, right, who's read The Dark Tower? And he had like 2 or 3 books at that point, and like 1 or 2 people put their hand up, and he was like, oh, because he knew it wasn't nearly as popular. I feel that the Jerusalem Man books, the John Shannon books, are kind of like that for Gemmell.
Yeah,
I read them when they came out over here, and I've got an omnibus. It's like 900-page, huge, giant fucking thing, tome that I could kill a water buffalo with easily. I read that when it came out, and I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I've now started reading The Dark Tower years later, and I can already see, there's huge differences, but there's a lot of similarities too. There's a lot of the kind of Western themes and the aliens or the monsters or the darkness within, or, all this kind of stuff. And I think they're amazing books that need a lot more attention.
Yep. I was just thinking about, like, what do you call the John Shannon books? Like, are they weird Western?
Yeah.
Kind of.
Post-apocalyptic.
Post-apocalyptic weird Western, yeah. I remember I plowed through those books. After the first one, I read nothing else until like I went through all of them like in a row.
Yeah.
I love those books.
Like as in some ways as twee as some of the Shannara books are. Terry Brooks is a phenomenal writer, but have you read his Word and the Void trilogy?
No.
Have neither of you read them?
No, sorry.
Okay. These are fucked up. they're fucking brilliant and they're dark. Years
Okay.
later, he kind of backdoored them into the Schnorrer books. And I was like, don't fucking do that because they're brilliant. But they're amazing. And they're like this. They're weird urban fantasy with demons in modern day. And it's like, it's got like very, very little magic in it. They're properly dark and fucked up. The first book's called Running with the Demon. And it's about a drifter who turns up in this town, this guy who's come to try and protect this young woman who's got like a dark past or something. But there's another guy that's turned up who's also what is after this young woman for some reason as well. And you don't know. So one of them is essentially like an agent of the Lord, kind of, and one of them's a demon, but he looks human. But it's in modern day, and then you've got all these little weird bits of magic around the end. And it's really fucking dark. And there's like post-apocalyptic nightmares in the book. And I loved them. And then again, people talk about Terry books. I talk about that, and they're like, what books? I'm like, fuck. They're worth seeking out. If you've never read them, the Word and the Void trilogy starts with Running with the Demon. Because it's another one of these things that you read an author that you love, then bring out something different. You're like, I don't know. And I read it, and I thought, I prefer this to some of the earlier Shannara.
Yeah.
It's that dark and messed up. So.
Yeah. I think I'm one of the few people who bounced off Shannara hard. I think I picked up the first book in high school library. Yeah. And I made it like 3 or 4 pages in and was like, wow. It was just like, that was it for me.
I'm pretty sure my dad had those ones. So that like those would be some of the ones that he tried to get me to read. And I wasn't.
It's a weird thing though. Like, so when they're much older and they belong to someone else and you pick them up, it's a lot more difficult. I did read the earlier ones because the first one came out in 1977, I think. And so I did read them when I was a teenager. So they were like much older. But then when they started bringing out new Shannara books, suddenly it's like, wait, these are my ones? No one else has read these before. No one knows what the fuck's going on with these. And they came out and they were darker as well. I think it was when he started getting into other things. And I thought, yeah, these are pretty cool. And I preferred them. And then he went a bit tween, a bit weird, and I drifted off again. But there's like a portion of like 4 books, much darker and much meatier and much more twisted. And those
we're sensing a theme in your reading taste.
You might be a grimdark
Gemmell
author,
brought in the darkness, and it never left. You know, that was kind of, yeah, it's true. But yeah, it started with Gemmell. It started with showing me beyond the kind of black and white of storytelling and to heroes that are as flawed as the villains and vice versa. You know.
Yeah. So, what would you say your first sort of not your first fantasy novel, but what was the first fantasy that made you really want to write? That sort of like clicked in that way that, you know, I think we all have a book that we're like, suddenly you want to tell that story, but your way kind of thing.
It has to be one of the Dragonlance novels, for sure.
Oh, interesting.
With Dragons of Twilight, Dragons of whatever it was, you know, those 3 books. It has to be one of them, because I suddenly saw some characters in there that were a bit different and flawed. And, you know, for all of the kind of roll a d12, create one of the characters that comes up in one like a D&D sheet, and you get like an elf and a dwarf and a this and a that and a mage and a knight. And it was very kind of basic, but there's some people in there that I'm like, that one is nothing like me, but kind of like me. And that's quite interesting. I haven't really seen that before. Like Tanis Half-Elven, a guy belongs to 2 cultures who don't get on, who don't like him, he doesn't belong. Shit, I can relate to that. I haven't got pointy ears, but that hits all of the right buttons for me. And at that point, I think I did write some Dragonlance fanfic. I was essentially writing my own stories about Minotaurs based on the world of Kryn. That technically, you know, I would have fanfic. No one gives a shit. But back then, I also did 3 chapters of an audiobook that I recorded myself on a cassette.
Oh,
that's awesome.
Wow.
I think like after that, I then recorded the radio music on the radio. Stop, pause, stop, pause, so I don't get the adverts. That was a few months later.
What was yours, Krystle?
Mine was Stormrider. So the fourth in the Briganti series. It was the first Flintlock fantasy I'd ever read. So like, not only had David Gemmell set a different tone morally, than my dad's fantasy. He then went to Flintlock fantasy, and it was like it's very Scottish coded, like it's very deeply, and that got me really good. And just the complicated morality of war that book tries to show, like, and the Winter K is such a good villain. Like, you hate that guy so much. It feels so good. But then also the main character's father should be a villain. He was the villain of the last book. He was the villain in Ravenheart. But it doesn't stay that way for him in Stormrider, in a way that was a really intelligent commentary on how we view history, and how the winners get to tell who our heroes are supposed to be, and that, like, all of the conversations in that book plus the different time setting, really, that was like, this is it for me, this is what I want. And I didn't end up all that far away from it. I'm about a century later in my own storytelling, so
yeah.
And the scale of fantasy settings, that's pretty close together.
Yeah, definitely some of the flavor there.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it was the Elric book, Stormbringer.
Nice.
I also wrote fanfic, which is basically, don't tell anyone, but it's Blackstone Heart.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
The one that was supposed to be a young adult novel.
Yeah. My failed young adult novel.
Your success.
I remember my test readers being like, no, this is not YA. You can't. He does terrible things to a corpse. You can't have that.
Putting the romance in necromancy.
Yeah. It seemed fitting at the time, but whatever. Anyway,
I mean, it is one of your bestsellers, isn't it? Like,
it is the bestseller. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. People are down for terrible things.
Yeah, for doing bad things with corpses. Like, I don't know. Y'all people are a little twisted. Something's wrong with you.
Oh man, you might be a grimdark author when
it gets in and never leaves. This is it. You see the darkness.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the Moiter, so the main character's father, is like that character is, I'm forever chasing that complexity when I'm trying to write stories, like, and I know I'll never get it as good as he did in that book, but I'm forever chasing somebody that bad but also somehow that good in the end. Like, oh, that was a good.
This actually reminds me, we're going to derail here a little bit. The difference between reading as a teenager and reading as a grumpy old fucker.
Yeah.
I swear books seemed deeper then. Like, my imagination was more willing to bring, to sort of fill in the cracks. Whereas now I'm kind of more aware of what's actually being written, what the actual words are. I don't know. I could be wrong on this, but I wonder if some of these, these books, which I haven't read in decades, if those characters really are as fantastic and deep and textured as I remember them, or if I just filled all that shit in. And if I went back and read it now, I'd be like,
I have gone back. Like, I've read, I think Stormrider.
Yes, but you're not old yet. You're just a wee kid.
I feel like I am jaded though. Like, I'm a really bitchy reader. I don't finish a lot of books. And it's like I think it's less the old bitchiness and more knowing the craft now. Where, like, once you know how to cook, then restaurants are less exciting because it's like, I could have done this at home for 10 cents on the dollar for what I'm paying for this right now, because I know how to make this, and I could have done a better job. And I think it's the same thing with books. I think once we know how the dishes are being made and the editing passes that go into it, suddenly we have the magic in our own hands, but also it robs a bit of the magic from us, because now we have the red pen trying to edit it to make it better.
So can you never turn off that critical part of your brain when you're reading any book, any fantasy book?
No, I can't. I read maybe 2 fantasy novels a year now.
Wow.
Because and I buy a lot more than that, which is painful. But like I make it maybe a chapter in, and I'm just kind of like, and it gets set aside for later. But I've got a library full of books that I've read the first chapter of. But every now and then I pick one up and I'm like, fuck, this is good, and I rip through it, and it's brilliant.
Are those very different from what you would write, or are they
always
aligned? Okay.
Yeah, they're not necessarily aligned in taste. Sometimes they're kind of similar, sometimes they're radically different. It's not really about genre. What's weird, like if I pick up a nonfiction, like a history book, I read that completely uncritical of the writing.
Yeah,
I don't know why. Like I'm not obsessing over every sentence thinking I would have written this differently. Like, fuck, who gives a fuck? But fiction and fantasy in particular, I can't turn it off. It sucks.
Yeah.
I'm able to do it. I'm able to turn it off, even with fantasy. Fantasy was my first love as a kid, reading. I think my parents worried because that was all I would read for a long time, but then they kind of realized he's always fucking reading, just leave him be. So
why won't you do drugs like the other kids?
Why don't you go out and get in some trouble? I'm busy reading. Oh, all right. But I think they kind of realized, he's reading, it's fine. But I'd never stop reading fantasy. I've read other things. I like crime, I like thrillers, I like supernatural stuff. But I always keep coming back to fantasy. Like someone said, whatever write something that was just a straight novel with no supernatural, no weirdness, no speculative elements in. And I thought about it, the answer was no. Even if I do like a modern day book, there's still going to be some weird shit in there, because ordinary life is fucking boring for the most part. There's a lot of shit in there. So if I can twist it and do something cool and weird, why wouldn't you? I still say you can write any kind of story you want at all. As long as you have certain kind of framing devices, you can slap a label on it and call it fantasy. I've done it loads of times, and people have gone, great fantasy novel. And I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. It's like, that first one wasn't a war book. Yeah. That second one wasn't a crime with a serial killer. That third one wasn't a post-apocalyptic horror. Sure, yeah, but it's fantasy. Okay, yeah, great, okay. Yeah. But I can turn that off. I love fantasy, and if I lost that passion, that would really piss me off. I love discovering new authors.
Yeah, it really
that's why
does.
Fletcher is so bright and shiny.
Mm-hmm. It sucked all the color out of my world.
This is it.
Literally.
Yeah. But I read like some people say, do you not feel you're going to steal the ideas, or do you not feel that you end up writing like that person? And it doesn't work that way. Like if I read a Robin Hobb,
no, it doesn't work.
I'm never going to write like Robin Hobb. I don't write characters that brutalized, that rich, that dark. But reading her book makes me go, oh, this is amazing. And it energizes me to go and do my own thing my own way. But if I have a slow book that I'm struggling with, or a new author, like I get sent arcs and I don't read many of them, because it's going to take me an extra week to get my head into their headspace, to read what they're doing and work out what they're doing, and then just go with it. And if I'm doing that when I'm trying to write, that will knock me off kilter completely. And I'm just like, I can't fucking do it. So I'm like, I know that author. I'll read the next whatever it is and pick it up and read it. And I'm cool. I could just kind of breeze through that. But new authors are a challenge until you get used to their rhythm. Yeah. Which is why the Book of Elsewhere was a fucking nightmare to read, but it was brilliant. The Keanu Reeves and Channing Yergel one. Jesus Christ, that book was hard going on purpose. It was designed to be. So like no one else apart from China could have written it.
Yeah.
But you can't breeze through that book.
Yeah. The guilt of I should be writing when reading is the other aspect which I have a lot of trouble shaking. Like, I pick up a book and my laptop is like, hey, You've got 2 books you're in the middle of writing. Why don't you get the fuck over here and get back to work, lazy fucker?
You could knock out
I had
200
that-
words. Just, no problem. Just do it.
I had that for a while, but then after like 3 years, what year is it now? Yeah, 3 years of only reading a couple of books a year. I was like, I can't. I'm so empty. Like I can't even write properly anymore because all of my inspiration has been burned up and I'm not refilling it anymore. So this year I did force myself to read more. And I'm really glad that I did, because I've hit some things that are slightly outside of what I might have normally picked up, but they were so good that it was like, okay, all right, yeah, I see what you're doing and I see why it's working on me, and I'm a little bit jealous, and now I gotta go right. So yeah, I haven't lost it, although I do find I do better with books that are ever so slightly adjacent to what I would naturally gravitate towards, because they have more capacity to surprise me.
Yeah, maybe I need to try that a little more. As fantasy, but not the sort of typical fantasy that I normally reach for.
Yeah, just ever so slightly off to a different tone or setting or what have you. Because like I said, that stuff surprises me more. Yeah. And that surprise is where the fun is, right? But also the familiarity of, fantasy is my home, like you were saying, Stephen. Like I am a multi-genre reader, but fantasy is home.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So there you go. You got your therapy session.
Yeah, fantasy is home.
Thank you so much for fixing us, Stephen. I really appreciate this. This is a really high bar for.
That's what I'm paid to do.
For the next guest. Yeah. Stephen fixed us. So what are you going to talk about?
Top that, fuckers.
Yeah, we'll have to bring up some new issues for the next episode.
Yeah,
I'm sure we'll find some.
Yeah. You and I have plenty.
What do you mean you and I?
Skeletons.
Fuck you, I'm fine.
Plenty of shit.
Yeah, you're fine.
Lost all colours bleached out of him.
Yeah, next time we'll have tie-dye Fletcher because he's fixed.
Just like Roy Kent.
And on that note.
Yeah, on that promise that I cannot deliver, sorry folks, he will not be tie-dyed next time. I can't actually fix him. Thank you very much for coming on, Stephen. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, man.
Thank you. Thanks, man.